Well, good evening, everybody. It's my great pleasure to be here in the UK. It's nice to be driving on the right side of the road again, or the left side, the correct side. It's nice to encounter humour that's actually funny, and it's nice to be able to get fresh food, and it's nice to spell words according to the King's English. So I'm enjoying myself. It doesn't have the glamour of America, but it has more beauty, I think. And but one thing I don't like is the weather. So if you could just fix that, it would probably be the perfect place. But yes, it is great to be here. I think every Australian feels like coming to the UK is like coming to the motherland. Most of us have British heritage. This evening I have been asked to speak on the subject of living in Babylon. Those of you who are aware of what I do, and based on the hands that went up, there's a few of you. You may have heard me speaking on similar themes in the past, so I'll try not to do too much of a repeat for you, but I'll have to stick to the brief to some degree this evening. But a little word, first of all, on the connection between, say, this and Answers in Genesis. And the connection is that Answers in Genesis, founded by Ken Ham, a fellow Australian from the same city as me, Brisbane, Australia, he really had a burden to defend the authority of the book of Genesis, especially the first 11 verses, and by implication the whole of the scriptures, particularly by addressing what were the real cultural flashpoints of his day, which were those things that arose due to sort of naturalism and the scientific critique of the Bible. And you had, this wave of people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and this kind of thing saying the Bible doesn't stack up scientifically, the Bible doesn't stack up historically, Genesis is a load of hocus pocus, and of course that came from the broader problem of Darwinism and other things. And so Ken started a ministry that defended the authority of Scripture from the first verse, especially in its scientific and its historical reality. And he's done a great work, and many of us have been greatly affected by that. As a child, I was affected by that. I remember my dad put a series of 12 VHS cassettes. They still existed. It must have been just going out of fashion. And there's 12 VHS cassettes under our television of Ken Ham. And as a kid, between the Flintstones and Inspector Gadget, I put on these 12 VHS cassettes. And I learned things then that I still rely on today. I've done a lot of work with young people, and whenever this issue comes up, I still draw on the things I learned. And so he's had a huge impact. Now, I have never been in that space, however, but I have for a long time been speaking about Genesis. In fact, I had a series of talks that I delivered at our youth programs in Australia called Genesis Blueprints, and sometimes I even called it Creationism 2.0. And this was before I had any idea of ending up going to Answers in Genesis. But the reason being that it was the same authority from the same fundamental part of the Bible to answer a whole range of additional issues that have arisen in our day that are the cultural flashpoints of 2023, and they are social, cultural, and ethical issues. And if you go to Genesis 1 to 11, you will see the blueprints that answer the very things that this generation is now grappling with through, for lack of a better phrase, the whole woke movement and the change in culture that we are seeing in our time to move us away from a Judeo-Christian ethic and culture to a different kind of ethical system and culture. What blueprints do I mean? Well, I mean blueprints, for example, and I was at this conference in London the last 3 days. It wasn't a Christian conference, but they were getting up to talk about, how they had to somehow restore Western civilization, but without the Christianity part, thank you very much, and which isn't going to work. So, but anyway, they got up to talk about that, and they talked about all the things they needed to restore. For example, the absolute equality of value of every human life. And they said, that's the foundational value of the West. And I sort of wanted to say, well, why, though? Why? And the only reason is because God made every human life. Or we can look at other issues. The sexuality issue is all around us. The gender identity issue is all around us. From the trans thing all the way up to what gender now means, which is my sense of how I feel about myself, through to the issue of increasingly race politics and racial divisions. Again, the fundamental answer to that is in Genesis, and we're going to see that. You can even look at the issue, which is huge here, bigger than Australia, bigger than America, but the environment stuff and the whole issue of the future of the planet and what's going to happen to it as we destroy it under our own hands. Well, you know what? There's some great principles that answer that concern from Genesis. But there's also another one in Genesis 1 to 11, which goes all the way up to the Tower of Babel. The Americans call it Babel, so I always have to explain that I mean Babel, but I don't have to do that here. The Tower of Babel. And at the Tower of Babel, you see there a blueprint for something else. You see there a blueprint for human power, human-built powers that oppose God. And it's a warning to us. It shows us what human powers will look like throughout history as they rise and as they fall. And we get some really important lessons from it. And that's what I mean when I say living in Babylon. Where was the first Babylon, the first human power and culture and system that opposed God? It was at Babel in Genesis chapter 11. But it was only the first, and we're going to see that in a minute. In Scripture, you see that this use of the word Babylon is twofold. The first use is just as a straight historical account. If you go and look in the Bible, in the book of Daniel, for example, or a number of the prophets, you see what we know from history, that Babylon was a mighty empire that existed for quite a long period of time, immediately preceding the Persian Empire. And it happens to have been the empire that besieged Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and took God's people into exile. It's a historical place. But see, Babylon was a certain kind of historical place. It was the kind of historical place that swallowed up God's people so that they were taken out of a God-fearing sort of cultural milieu and drawn into a pagan one. And it used its power and its technology and its culture, wherever it spread, to oppose the true and living God. And so God's people within Babylon were struggling against Babylon's culture to proclaim the truth of the living God. Now, wherever that kind of power is seen in the Bible, therefore, sometimes Scripture uses Babylon not just to describe the real historical empire of Babylon and the city, but as a metaphor to try and say that this is the same kind of thing. So, for example, Nineveh is called Babylon in one place. Tyre is called Babylon in one place. If you go to Peter's letters in the New Testament, you will see there that Peter says, he uses all this Babylon-style language. He addresses his readers as exiles. And you think, well, for Jews, what are exiles? Well, of course, it's the Babylonian exiles that were taken from Jerusalem. And he talks to them about the fiery trial that's about to come upon them to test them. What was the fiery trial? Well, it was the three friends who were thrown into the fiery furnace. And then he talks at the end about those who are living in Babylon, and it's almost certainly not actually Babylon, it's just too far away. It's probably referring to the culture of the time, the Roman Empire, Rome. And then, of course, you get to Revelation, and what do you find in Revelation? You find another one. And I'm not going to upset anybody's views this evening on where that is and what that is exactly, or we could be in for a fun time. So I'm not going to do that, but I am just going to say there's another one. And it's described again as a great city, a great empire, a great civilization with so much wealth and all this, and it's one that collapses, and there's views that abound. But you see there that Babylon is a place, it's also a metaphor. It stands for man's system of power and culture that in their pride oppose God. And the first one is in Genesis chapter 11, and we might as well read it. Genesis chapter 11. You know, Scripture really sees Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon as almost like a reincarnation of Babel. And you can see that from the dreams, and we'll get to that in a minute. In Genesis chapter 11, verse 1, it says, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.' And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Now what do we learn here about human endeavours and powers as they band together to oppose God in this city? You know, we learn a number of things that travel through the whole Bible whenever it speaks of such powers and cultures. We learn first of all that every Babylon is based on pride. You read there, come, what's the founding philosophy of this? Why are they doing it? They say, come, let us make a name for ourselves. And I've just been at this conference in London. Some of you might have read about it, called ARC, sort of headed up by Jordan Peterson and a bunch of others. And what did they do? They got together a whole bunch of the who's who's from all over the world. You know, you look one way and there's Dave Rubin, another way there's Nigel Farage, another way there's Dennis Prager, and then another way and there's Michael Gove, and another way and there's 3 former Australian Prime Ministers. And everyone's together because they're all going to be the anti-World Economic Forum and the anti-Davos, right? It's very interesting. I sat through a number of sessions, and I just wrote down the main point of each session for a full day. And at the end of the day, I turned to the people around me, and I read out the main points, and I said, is it just me? Or is every single one of these main points an explicit biblical teaching? And it turned out that, yes, they were explicit, mostly Genesis teachings. All about, you know, the antidote to the environmental thing, the antidote to the life thing, the antidote to, you know, all this stuff. But here was the problem. The whole point of the conference. I mean, Jordan Peterson said it this way. He actually quoted the scripture, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And what he did was, he said, so we need faith to rebuild a better story and a better civilization. I thought, interesting. And they said, and what faith is? It's our ability to cast our vision of the future, to cast it out upon the waters, he said, and then take responsibility in ourselves to achieve that vision. I said, that's not faith. But that's what he does. He always denies the God part of the Bible and makes it about us. And you know what that is? We're going to bring back the fruits of Christianity without Christ, and we're going to do it ourselves. And the whole thing was about the greatness of us, the greatness of this room of so-called elites and their ability to turn things around. I tell you what, without Christ, because we didn't do that. All those fruits they talk about that the West enjoyed, God did that. And God did it because of the prevailing faith of the people in Him and in the Lord Jesus, not in their ability to cast a vision on the waters and take responsibility. It wasn't anything to do with that. But see, the point is this. They're saying we're going to do God's work ourselves. And there's a pride there, isn't there? We're going to raise ourselves up to achieve this. And we're going to have great conferences and committees. It'll never work. Now that's one classical interpretation of this Babel spirit. Come, let's make a name for ourselves. It's one we all think of. People getting together and say we're going to achieve great things ourselves. But I want to suggest that in the modern West, it runs a little deeper than that. Because in the modern West, now for at least 10 years, probably significantly longer in slightly weaker forms, there is a whole philosophy of life that is being taught to a new generation and that is being lived out increasingly in the social, cultural and political life of our nations, which is a philosophy of life which is all about fundamentally making the self great. I mean, I call it the identity theory of life. And you can look at the curriculum resources being distributed in our schools, and you will see that very early on in life, young children are told that what they need to do early is to find out what their identity is. And to find out what their identity is, they need to look within themselves. They need to understand their feelings and their self-story, and they need to know what their various internal subjective attributes are, and they need to articulate them. And having articulated them, they need to then live that out. They need to live authentically to their true self. And they need to surround themselves with people who will acknowledge them, who will see them, who will make them visible, who will champion them and not erase them. And they need to take that into their political life as well and have a political philosophy based on their identity politics. Because their identity might be that they have passions and desires for people of the same sex, so they've got a gay identity. And then their identity might be that they've got a certain cultural heritage, so they've got a racial minority identity. And then their identity might be that they feel a certain way about themselves, and so therefore they've got a gender identity. And all of a sudden they realize all the ways in which the world is oppressing them, and they go out there and that's their political creed. They rage against the oppression, and it's highly destructive. Now this is the identity theory of life among us, and what is it really all about? It is about looking at yourself and living your life in such a way that it makes yourself the guiding light, the greatest value, the highest priority. I mean, what do we call June now? Pride Month. And nobody blushes that we actually take pride and turn it into a marketing slogan rather than a grave sin against God. But what is pride? What is the cultural situation that enabled us to celebrate that? It is a cultural situation that said we should be proud of whatever it is that is in our true selves. And it matters not whether that is in defiance of God or against God's law or against God's way. We must hold it up and we must live a life that realizes and fully brings out who we are on the inside, and we must be proud of it, and the world must look on and celebrate it. We must make ourselves great. That is the whole philosophy of our day. The greatness of the self. Babylon is proud. And we live in an age of unbelievable individual pride. And it goes all the way to the top, where we believe that we can achieve what we want to achieve. I listen to the World Economic Forum as well, and they're on about the same thing. They say that our destiny, it says we must take our destiny into our own hands. That's what Klaus Schwab actually said. Pride. But see, here's the other thing about Babylon, is it's not just proud. It is rebellious, which is the natural consequence, right? Because if you look within and you say, this is just who I am, and I will make this great and make this the guiding light of how I live my life, then the problem is that maybe what is within is not good. Maybe what is within, maybe living out the way we feel is going to lead us into a life that opposes God's will. Right? And so we're faced with this problem. Do we carry on and rebel against God? Or do we submit to God? And Babylon becomes rebellious, because as it seeks to follow its own philosophy of pride, it ends up rebelling against God himself. It's interesting, there's a particular kind of pride that is prevalent in all the Babylons of Scripture. And it's described in an interesting way. At Babel, a particular kind of rebellion, at Babel, we see that they've got this city called Babel, and in the city they want to build a tower. And the thing that's said about the tower is its top will reach into the heavens. And people wonder about that and what it means. You know, the same idea exactly is in Daniel chapter 4, when King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And in his dream, his empire is depicted as a great tree. And the tree grows, right? And it's strong, and it has great branches, and it bears fruit, and the peoples and the animals come and, get shelter under it. But there's a point at which that tree, it says its top reached into heaven. Exactly the same thing. And then what happens? An angel comes down, looks at the tree, and says, strike it down. It's very, very Babel-like, but the same problem, a tree. And when did things go wrong? When the tree reached heaven. If you go to Isaiah chapter 14, and it says there, take up this taunt against the king of Babylon, and it recites the king of Babylon's sins, and it says there, you have raised your throne up, you have raised yourself up to the throne of God. You have sat upon the heights of heaven. You have said, I will make myself like the Most High. Same idea exactly, something about reaching into, sitting in heaven. And that's the condemnation. That's the judgment. And then you go to Revelation 18, and there you get this other Babylon, and it says, fallen is Babylon the Great. And it says, her sins are heaped as high as heaven. You say, well, what's going on here? If you do go in your own time and read Isaiah 14, you'll see it explained pretty well. What's going on here is that the pride of these people, the pride of this power, the rebellion has got to such an extent that actually they are now seeking to sit on God's throne and do things that only God should have the power to do. They want to define things that God, by his power, has already defined. They want to reorder boundaries that God, by his power, has already set in creation. It's a kind of power that seeks to make ourselves like God, the Creator. Now I say to you, do we have this problem today? You know, it all started a long time ago, but boy, the things we could go through. Take, for example, the gender issue. What's the thing about gender? Well, I look at this room, and what do I see? I see a lot of ladies and gentlemen. There is a creation reality that's in our face every single day, in every single space we inhabit, that we are men and women. And God, by his creation power, has made it thus. But of course, what do we say in Babylon? We say, I don't care. So what? God might have done that. It might be obvious. But I feel a certain way. My identity is such that if I draw that out and make that my highest value, what God has done doesn't matter. I'm the creator now. I say, I feel, therefore God's work means nothing to me. That's Babylon. That's pride. That's rebellion. It's exactly what we're talking about. You can take, for example, again, the sexuality issue, and I won't go into too much detail, but just the fact that men and women are clearly designed for each other biologically. The Apostle Paul raises this in Romans 1, and he says, you know what? The fact that people would deny that and say, no, I would like to be with whomever I want, not with the person that God has biologically designed me to be with. The fact that we call it queer these days, again, it's a denial of what God has done in creation. It's a denial of God's order. And the Apostle Paul says it's against nature, and that's what he means. He means it's against what has been done by God in his creation power. And so we raise ourselves up and say, well, God might have done that and said that, but we're the creators now. We can recreate marriage itself. And of course, our legislature claims to do that. They can't. They can pretend, but God has made marriage ever since he made a man and a woman. What about the pro-life debate? This is an interesting one. How is it that we know, and this came up at the conference in the last few days, how is it that we know that human life is its own unique category of life, and it is more valuable than other kinds of life? Well, there's two ways we know. First of all, we know because we know that humans are just different to animals. They're not just smarter than animals, but they're capable of objective, and they're capable of, to say, standing outside of themselves and looking at themselves. They're capable of objective reason. They're capable of building and creating. Their ingenuity is far above the animals. They're capable of a certain kind of relational life. They're capable of a certain kind of creativity. They're capable of a certain kind of moral dignity, and they're capable of so many things that the animals just are not capable of. They're evidently different. Okay? The fact that we're here tonight, sitting around listening like this, we're different. But God has said that it's human life alone that he made in his image. God has said it's human life alone into which is his own God-breathed life. And so we find that in Scripture. And in Genesis 9, we see that there is a hierarchy set where, if an animal takes a human life, the animal dies. If a human takes a human life, the human dies. Human life is unbelievably valuable. Now, every piece of DNA that makes me tonight as that human being was there at my conception. So how do we know that a human life is a human life that is totally valuable? Well, God has said, but we also know from the creation reality we see all around us and the scientific reality. But see, what do we say? We say again, just like on the gender issue, so what? You know what we want today? We don't just want to be able to define the moment at which a human life becomes a human life. We actually want the power to decide whether that human life is worthy based on how we feel about it. We want to be able to say it must be protected at all costs because of how I feel about it or because of my circumstances. Or say, no, it shouldn't even be dignified as a life because of how I feel about it or because of the circumstances. Again, it's the same kind of rebellion, isn't it? We take what God has done and we say, we're the creators now. We are lords of lives now. And it's the same too with the other end of life, euthanasia, same thing. We're lords of these lives. I could take the race issue as well, and this is a very hot button one. On the race issue, very interesting, race politics, I'll say. I've tried to work out what's going on here. It's a big deal in America in particular. It's interesting if you look at what the critical race theorists would write on this stuff. So people like Robin DiAngelo, people like Ibram X. Kendi. I was studying this stuff thinking, what really is the issue? Do you know what the issue is? It's a creation issue. Because what they say is that there are many races, and they say that these races are divided. These races have barriers between them that cannot be ultimately climbed, where the lived experience of someone with a particular pigment and the lived experience of someone with another pigment are so radically different. The truths that they encounter are so radically different that we can never understand each other. We can never have real insight into each other, and therefore we will only ever oppress each other and victimize each other. And here's the thing, there's no solution. There's actually no solution. You read right to the end of those books looking for a solution, and one is not offered, except to say we have to keep trying. Because they believe that there are many races impossibly divided by barriers to our humanity that fundamentally cannot be scaled. But what does the Apostle Paul do when he speaks at Mars Hill? This is really important. Paul goes to Mars Hill and he's speaking to the Athenians as a Jew. It's a different race. And what Paul says to them is, he says, you know what? God made from one man all the peoples of the earth. And he set the times and the periods and the boundaries of their dwelling places. That's where he begins. One race. Now, they deny that. One race. But see, there's implications of one race. He says, you know what the implication of one race is? That there is one God for all. And if there's one God for all, there is one truth for all. And if there's one truth for all, there's one gospel for all. And that's his talk. That's what he says. You know, the critical race theory stuff really undermines that. It says, no, there's not one truth. And therefore you can't have one gospel, one God, one race. It's a creation issue. But you know what? We know that we're all one race. Science tells us, the scientific papers on the subject tell you, it's the same DNA. It's the same species. It's the same everything, with little tiny minute genetic differences like skin tone. We know this, but when we make ourselves like God and seek to create our own creation boundaries and our own definitions of reality, how wrong we get it. I'll do one more. The one more I want to do is the climate issue, the environmental issue. Because I don't know, there's something about the UK, it's in your face everywhere you go. And it's interesting. What is the concern when it comes to the climate issue? The concern is effectively a civilization-ending catastrophe. That's the problem that's held out. You know, in Genesis chapter 9, God says to Noah the same thing that he said in Genesis chapter 1, which is be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, increase abundantly in the earth, and multiply in it. Now, that command's never been qualified, never been revoked, never been reduced, right? It still stands. And there's at least one man in the room with 7 children, so he knows it still stands. I said in the US it's not such a big deal, actually. There's a lot of big families around, my goodness. But, you know, basically God is saying, be abundantly, superabundantly fruitful. In other words, something we might today say, well, I think God knew that we'd come to a point where we would say, oh yes, but overpopulation. Oh yes, but resource depletion. Oh yes, but we've only got 12 years on whatever model we just made. Oh yes, but. Because we think that we have power and control over the ultimate destiny of the planet. But it's significant, therefore, to me that God said in the immediately preceding breath, so long as the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. He said that, didn't he? Now, I think he said it right there for a very good reason. And it might not have been for them at the time, but it certainly is for us today. You know, the planet is on God's timeline. And it will be done when he's done with it. Now, it's interesting. I heard one preacher say, if you think we're messing up the planet now, wait till you see what Jesus does with it when he gets back. It's kind of a fair point. You know, and I divide between things. I don't, you know, there are things that are within our immediate sphere of opportunity that sort of just qualify as decent and good things, like, you know, preserving national parks, getting plastics out of the ocean, you know, being clean. Nothing wrong with that. Probably good, right? But that's not a concern about the overall paradigm. The overall paradigm is under control. But of course, this is the other thing about Babylon, is it's not just proud and rebellious, and the kind of rebellion is a rebellion against the Creator. We want to make creation anew in our own image. That's the rebellion. But it's also, underneath its pride, is it's very anxious. And that's what happens when you no longer have faith in God. You only have fears. It's interesting, in Babel, the reason why they do what they did is lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. It's a fear that is driving them. But of course, God has literally just told them, scatter abroad across the face of the whole earth. That's what he's just said. And of course, they've said, oh, what they've done, first of all, is forget about God. And having forgotten about God and forgotten his promise and forgotten his command, it's all up to them. And as soon as it's all up to them, it's very scary. Because the world is big and bad and brutish and it's beyond them. And so they're afraid. And that is one of the reasons why they rebel. You know, that anxiety is there in the climate debate because we have rejected God. And we've forgotten his promises. And we're no longer seeking to work to his timeline and his plan. We're seeking to do it all ourselves, and it's terrifying. And this anxiety runs right through a godless culture. As far as we can measure this, in the modern West right now, we are raising the most anxious and depressed generation we have ever seen. It's very interesting. This was raised at the conference the last 3 days. This is actually fascinating. And the guy who raised it was putting up all of this research and saying right around 2008, everything went south. Everything fell apart. Suicide rates among young women, highest they've been in all of history. Suicide rates among young men, #1 killer of young men. Depression rates, multifold increases. Something like, I forget the number, but some incredible number. Something like I think it's 1 in 10 young people have had suffered from a mental health issue in the last 12 months. And so it goes on. And then it's interesting, the researcher just said there's only one category of young people who are not experiencing any change to their historic mental health. Conservative Christians. Isn't that interesting? And then he said, that's probably because they don't use their phones as much, and moved on. And I thought to myself, no. You don't get to say that. See, here's the thing. There is something about the removal of that confidence that we have in God, leaving it all up to you, is terrifying. I mean, I am so glad that God says he works all things together for good, for them that love Christ and are called according to his purpose. And so it doesn't really matter what happens. I know that the end result is going to be for good. And Joseph saw that at the end of his life. Genesis 50:20. Man, what a life he lived. Jailed for 13 years, sold into slavery, all the stuff you definitely don't have on your bucket list. And he says in Genesis chapter 50:20, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And he proved it with his life. What a confidence we have. What a confidence we have in Ephesians 1:11, which says that he is working all things according to the counsel of his will. I don't know how he's doing that, but the disciples at the foot of the cross didn't know how he was doing that either. It didn't look very optimistic. And yet, against the odds, and that's the way it'll be in the second coming, it'll be against the odds. It'll suddenly happen, and we'll go, well, we didn't see that coming. And we'll see how that all the works of the demons and devils of hell, which seem to be so successful, were actually simply hastening the day of his coming. What a confidence we have, but Babylon has lost that confidence. It's terrified. I think that's the source of cancel culture. Cancel culture always comes against people who speak the truth about very fragile lies. If you go out there and you speak real truth about the gender issue, you are speaking truth against a very, very fragile lie. And that is why you can expect to face opposition, and why many people have faced career-ending opposition on that very subject. Now, those are the lessons we learn about Babylon from Babel. I kind of banged on a bit longer than I meant to, but that's okay. We learned a lot. Let me mention 2 more things before concluding. So 3 more things, really. 2 more things from Revelation's Babylon. Because we've got to answer a question. It's one thing to look at the world and look at our culture and say, well, this is what it's like. Yeah, so what? What now? Well, we need to learn then where we go from here, how we understand it in relation to our own lives. And in Revelation, you start to see the beginning of that, because in Revelation 17 and 18, we learn a few things about what Babylon does. Depicted there is this woman who is representative of a great city, which has power over the peoples of the earth, which is seducing the kings of the earth, and so on. And we learn there what she does, what Babylon does to God's people. Because in Daniel's day, that's what happened. Babylon was over there, and then all of a sudden, God's people had to live within it. And there's 2 things you learn from Revelation. One is in Revelation 17:6. It says, I saw this woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. In other words, Babylon, these cultures, these societies, they seek to persecute God's people. And we've seen that throughout history. As they rise and as they fall, what do? They always put the sights on God's people. And there is a certain, it's weird because there's always a certain tolerance in these Babylons. In Babylon itself, it was an incredibly multi-deity, pagan, pantheistic, multi-cultured kind of society. It spread across the whole world. But there was a particular kind of intolerance that we saw there. It was the intolerance that Daniel faced and that his friends faced when they ended up in the lion's den and in the fiery furnace and, not eating the king's food and, wondering whether they were going to get their heads cut off. That intolerance was leveled against something. It is always leveled against any person who gives testimony or witness to a God who is the creator God, who has something to say about Babylon's rebellions. That's the God they won't accept. That's the intolerance. And so it is when God the creator comes along with something to say, some point to call to account in relation to gender, life, sexuality, etc. It's that stuff. That's when you can expect to face hostility. And that's what we see. That's what we see in our day. One of the things I did in Australia was help with some other people to start a law firm which was dedicated to helping people who get in trouble with the law for living out their faith. You have groups here that do the same thing, like the Christian Concern and things like that. And they take up the cases of people who have in the workplace been fired or stood down, or who have been kicked out of the fostering system, or who have been denied the opportunity to adopt children, or whatever. I mean, one of the big things we did in Australia, and one of the probably the very beginning of my work there, was defend Australia's best football player, Israel Folau. I think it was news over here as well, so some may remember it, who posted a paraphrase of a Bible verse on his Instagram account, which of course had something to say about sexuality. And what happened? He was fired and he was banned for life from his football game. And he still is not allowed to play football anywhere in Australia for any club or any code. That's the kind of Babylon we live in. Now, it's not the kind of hostility that we see that creates martyrs. We're not there. In history, it's been brutal. People have died. People have gone to the lions. Daniel was put in absolutely life-threatening situations and delivered by the hand of God. But it is the kind of hostility that Jesus talks about when he says, "Blessed are the persecuted for righteousness' sake." Because he goes on to say, you say, well, persecution. Well, are we really persecuted? Well, he defines his terms. He says, blessed are those. He says, blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Reviling is angry disgust, bigot, homophobe, hater, and all sorts of other insults. There's angry disgust in the society. In Australia, young people that I speak to and all that, the real concern they have is, but what happens when I step out into my workplace and my university and people find out what I believe? They're not going to like me. Because I'm going to say at some point, because I'm supposed to be a good witness and the light's meant to be on, not hidden under a basket, I'm going to say I'm a Christian. And what are they going to want to know? Yeah, but what kind of Christian are you? Right? Are you one of those, bigoted Christians? Yeah, right? That's the problem you face. It's a negativity. It's a hostility. And I tell them, I say that is a feature, it's not a bug in the Christian life. Certainly in a Babylon-type society. Certainly in a society that's gone this way. But it is interesting, isn't it, that when Daniel and his friends stood up and stood out in their generation, and all that hostility came against them, those were precisely the moments in which God worked most openly and most powerfully. I often say to people, God works in the fires. He worked in the fire to reach a pagan king and convert him. Isn't it amazing? I mean, there was a few. It took a while, actually. He had a few encounters and had to be humbled several times. But he got there. God got him there. God works in the lion's den. May the God who you serve, says Darius, save you from the lion's den. What a witness. And we've seen that in Australia, and I'm not familiar enough with the historical, political context here to know, but we have seen that it's in those moments when when the light shines the brightest, when the difference, the witness to Christ is seen. And we should aspire to be used in that way. We really should. Jesus said, "Blessed are the persecuted for righteousness' sake." Do we believe that? Do we believe it? I mean, I don't think we do. I can tell stories of people who just shy away from moments where they should stand up or should stand out, and they don't, because they don't believe that there's a blessing. They don't believe great is your reward in heaven. And I used to think Paul and Silas were half mad singing hymns in jail all night. But I learned when I did the legal work with so many of these clients, at the end of it all, I would ask a question and I would say, "Would you do it again?" And they always said yes. Always. And at the end of it all, they all had a bit of a Joseph experience where they said, "That was for good." And I'm so glad it happened. Israel Folau still, lost his millions, lost his career. I said to him on stage once, "Would you do it again?" And the words weren't even out of my mouth. And he said, "Yes, absolutely." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because there is a peace that comes from knowing Christ in these moments that is priceless and cannot be replicated." Do we believe it? Babylon persecutes, and it's a particular kind of hostility. But see, this world, we say, well, let's not talk about those things that they don't need to hear, that they don't want to hear. You know what? The world needs someone to speak the truth into this culture. The prophets did that. They stood up in their culture and they spoke the truth their culture needed, not the lies their culture wanted. And Jesus did the same. He did it to the rich young ruler, in fact. The rich young ruler came to him saying, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus looked at him and loved him, it says. And in today's world, we might think to ourselves, "Oh, well, if he loves him, there's going to be a real warm, fuzzy encounter. It's all going to be very nice." He says at the end of that section that the rich young ruler walked away sad. Well, he loved him and he sent him away sad? Why? Because he loved him enough to tell him the truth he needed, not the lie he wanted. Because he came to him and said to him, "Oh, I follow all these commandments since my youth." And then Jesus, in one line, shows him he hasn't even kept the first one. Sell everything you have. No other gods before me? Really? Yeah. Our culture needs people to speak the truth it needs. And one of the things I learned in Australia is, we went out on a lot of what we might call edgy topics. There wasn't enough people speaking about these issues and giving a gospel-focused and biblically grounded answer on all the issues of the day. And what shocked me is when I left the ministry I was doing there early this year, the number of people that have subsequently contacted me and contacted the ministry to say, this was my life. I was in the LGBT community. I was gender dysphoric, but I found your stuff and I became a Christian. Absolutely blew me away. We shouldn't be surprised. But sometimes the noise and the anger of the hostility makes us think that that's all there is. But you just don't know who's listening. You just don't know what quiet work of God is happening in the hearts of people who are looking for truth and are looking for answers. Babylon persecutes. That has an implication for us. The second one, though, people say to me, do you think it's going to get worse? I don't know if it's going to get worse. And I'll tell you why. Because Babylon has another tool in her toolkit. It's not just persecution. She doesn't just have one hammer. She's got something else, and she will use it if she can. There in Revelation 17:18, you realize that Babylon is depicted as a great harlot, and she's holding out wine, and she's adorned in scarlet and gold, and she's this picture of luxury, this picture of wealth, this person who is holding out sin and holding out indulgence and holding out a good time. And what's she doing to the peoples of the earth and the kings of the earth? She's saying to them, what she's trying to do is she's trying to seduce them away from faithfulness to Christ to faithfulness to her instead. And the way she does it is by saying, you can belong here. You can have, if I was in the States, I'd say the American dream. You can have a successful career. You can have academic standing. You can have a house and a car and a boat and all the things that you crave. You can have the life that Babylon offers. The one thing you have to do is show that you belong. The one thing that you have to do is show that you are not going to upset my values system. Isn't that what Daniel faced on day one in Babylon? When Babylon comes along and says, mate, you have been selected, handpicked for a place in Oxford University, and it is a fast-track program to get you straight into the Houses of Parliament, to stand in the presence of the Prime Minister and to work in the public service as one of the most powerful people in the United Kingdom. I mean, here's a guy who's just been through conquest and siege, young man, probably 15-ish, something like that, who's offered the world everything. And Babylon comes along and says, we want you. We want you to belong and we want you to be part of us. You only have to do one thing. You have to show that you belong. You have to eat the food. What does Daniel do? You know, you can imagine the pressures that would have come against Daniel. You know, God has blessed you with this opportunity, Daniel. You don't want to squander it. Oh, Daniel, it's too early. Wait until you've got some more power and status. Wait until you are someone. Then you can make a real difference. Keep your head down, Daniel. Well, Daniel, I'm glad Daniel didn't do that, because what Daniel decided to do was not make it so complicated. And sometimes Babylon comes along and asks us to belong. Babylon comes along and asks us to do small things that are sinful things, that are compromising things, so that we don't stand out, so that we don't show her up, so that we don't show the culture that we don't belong. And Daniel knew when that moment came, he had one job, and that was do the right thing. And my dad always used to say to us growing up, you'll never be any worse off for doing the right thing. And it's true. And Daniel learned it, because Daniel should have mucked everything up that day. He should have been in a position where he said, I can't do it. The eunuch would have said to him, I'm going to have to tell the king. And he said, you'll have your head. He actually said, he said, you'll have my head at least. And Daniel should have failed. But see, Daniel realized that he couldn't plan his future better than God could. Daniel realized that he needed God on his side, not his own manipulation, not his own games on his side. And he knew that if he did the right thing, he trusted God for the next thing. And that was the right call. Because Daniel served 6 kings anyway. You know, if God means you to be there, he'll keep you there. But you need him on your side. I remember in Australia we had a evangelical Christian Prime Minister, briefly. And he was really getting lost in the weeds. There was so much pressure against him. The media were at him. There was a real campaign on. And he was starting to do things that were really, really wrong. Really wrong. But he was doing it because he was chasing polls. And he was getting his team to poll everything. And whatever the outcome of the poll was, he'd do that. And he'd do that because he was feeling like the ship was sinking and he needed another sugar hit in the polls to get re-elected. And I actually spoke to him about this. And we tried to call him to account on something and say, you can't do this. You know, why are you in politics as a Christian if you can't even stand on this issue? And he said, but we need to win the election. He said, there's no point having power, there's no point having good intentions if you don't have power. We need to win the election. And so he went and he did the wrong thing in order to get a poll boost and in order to win the election. And I remember saying, you don't need the polls on your side. You need God on your side. Because you're going to lose in a culture like this, no matter what, unless God saves you. And of course they did the wrong thing and they lost the election. And that's just the way. Now, it's a very important lesson in life. We can't plan our future better than God can. And yeah, we need to be wise and we need to make calls that are going to, yield wise outcomes unless we're being asked to compromise and do the wrong thing. Then we just trust God with the future. And every one of us, and I believe every young person, has days of testing. I think back in my life and I see days of testing where the offer comes along. Hey, you could have this. You could be this. Or the threat comes along. Hey, if you don't compromise, if you don't do this, then you will lose everything. You will lose your social standing. You will lose your friendship group. You could lose your job. Or you will face some kind of stigma in the workplace that means you're not going to get promoted. Or whatever. Fill in the blanks. There's endless examples. And we're called in those moments to do what Daniel did. To say no to Babylon's seduction. Because that's what she will do to you if she can't get you another way. And to say yes to doing the right thing, honouring God. And we trust God when we do that. And there will be days of testing. If you're a young person, there's a few of you here, there'll be days of testing when you have to make that decision. Make the right decision. You need God on your side and you'll never be any worse off for doing the right thing. It's interesting, I talked to a guy actually on the weekend from Australia who's working in politics. And he said, I'm going into politics, what should I do? How should I navigate it? I said, you know what you should do? I said, you should sit down and think very carefully about where your lines in the sand are. You should think very carefully about what's your line in the sand on the question of alcohol? What's your line in the sand on the question of, time with and interactions with people of the opposite sex? What's your line in the sand on church attendance? And I said, write them down. I said, make them safe. Because people fade, usually. They don't suddenly go all in and compromise. They usually fade slowly. And the standards are slowly dropped. And politics is a place where there'll be many opportunities to drop the standards. I believe that's what Daniel did. It says he purposed in his heart. He made a decision that he wasn't going to cross a line. So that when the day came, when the pressure was on, he had already made the decision. And that made it a lot easier. Because in the heat of the moment, we often make the wrong decision. In the heat of the moment with the pressure and the words in our ears and the context we're in and it's hard to see, we get it wrong. But if we know beforehand where the lines are, we're much more likely to get it right. And this brings me to a point, and I will start to wrap this up. I've been going for pretty much an hour. So, but let me say this. What we learn in Babel, what we learn in Daniel 5, what we learn in Revelation 18, is that every Babylon ends. There is a day that comes when it doesn't exist anymore. Daniel 5, Belshazzar's feast. 1,000 of his lords and him feasting. Daniel wasn't there, by the way. They had to go and find him. So again, he wasn't compromising. He was finishing as he started. He was standing apart and trusting God. But Belshazzar's feast happens and Babylon is gone. And that's when you hear that lament in Revelation 18. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Alas, alas, that great city. In a single hour her judgment has come. And it was in a single hour in the actual ancient Babylon, by the way. It was very quick and it was anyway, it just happened in the night when the Persians walked in under the wall, and that was that. And Belshazzar was killed. A day comes when it's all over. And on day one for Daniel, when all that pressure was on him, when that priceless offer was made to him, it would have been very difficult to know what the right thing to do was exactly. Sometimes we're in the moment, we struggle to see how to make the right decision, or we struggle with the cost of making the right decision. It's hard. But I tell you this, on Babylon's last day, it's very clear. Because there was a lot of people in Belshazzar's feast who built in Babylon. There's a lot of people there who owned things, who had power, who had status, who had place in Babylon. And what happened that night? They lost everything. Everything. The compromisers from day one who were compromising on the last day lost everything because every Babylon ends. Do you know who lost nothing that night? Daniel. Correct answer. Daniel lost nothing. It was amazing because he had built somewhere else right throughout his entire earthly legacy. And that day will come for all of us. And that is why when the judgment is read against Belshazzar, numbered, weighed, divided, he fails on every count. His days have been numbered and they've been empty days. He's been weighed and there's no substance in him because he's built in Babylon alone and not in the eternal kingdom of heaven. And therefore there's judgment that comes. And it's important to us we should number our days, allocate them to God's service. Consider when we are weighed in the balances on Judgment Day, when we're called to give an account, as we all will be, what will be there that's of worth and substance? I pray that God would give us the perspective of Babylon's last day on Babylon's early days, because it will end. And we can leave a great legacy, and I am finishing, but I want to say this. By doing that, look at how God used Daniel in his generation. A lot of people are really worried about today. They throw their hands up and they say, oh, well, it's all gone, it's all over, it's all lost. There's a lot of Chicken Littles, the sky is falling. And there's a lot of sort of wishing it was 1985 with Ronald Reagan again. And there's a lot of look at what we've lost and doom and gloom. You know what? God knows. God's not caught by surprise. God allowed it. Daniel knew that. He said, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the Lord's hands. God allowed this. He knew it was happening. And that means that God can enable us to leave a legacy in this day that is fruitful, that is extraordinary, that is lasting, and that is eternal for him. And that's what Daniel did. A king converted. A testimony that is famous. All the government officials know about him. They want to bring him down. They do a CIA investigation on him. How can we get this guy? They know he's righteous. Darius knows, the God who you serve, the Queen Mother on Babylon's last days. Get Daniel, the Spirit of the Holy God's in him. How many people were converted through Daniel's testimony? I'm sure it wasn't just Nebuchadnezzar. What about something else? When Jesus is born, who shows up at the birth of Jesus? From the east, Magi. What's east of Bethlehem? Babylon. Where else do we see the Magi? Do you know Daniel was the chief of the Magi in Babylon? And Daniel was a prophet. Why is that community of men, several hundred years later, still looking for the coming of the Savior of the world? That is Daniel's legacy in the East, among the Magi. And today, of course, it says he shines like the stars of the heavens because he turned many to righteous and he was wise, it says in Daniel chapter 12. You know, may God make us all Daniels, giving us the perspective to stand with him on the first day and be weighed and numbered on the last day and found to have left an eternal legacy in this day. And here's the other thing. In Daniel's day, there was only 4 of them that we know of, and God still did a mighty work. When Jesus died on the cross, there's 12 disciples in a small upper room, and God turned that whole empire, that Babylon, upside down. There's more than enough of us left to do a great work for God in our day.